A test or examination is an assessment intended to measure a test taker's knowledge, skill, aptitude, physical fitness, or classification in many other topics. A test may be administered verbally, on paper, on a computer, or in a confined area that requires a test taker to physically perform a set of skills. Tests vary in style, rigor and requirements. For example, in a closed-book test, a test taker is often required to rely upon memory to respond to specific items, whereas in an open-book test, a test taker may use one or more supplementary tools such as a reference book or calculator when responding to an item. A test may be administered formally or informally. An example of an informal test would be a reading test administered by a parent to a child. An example of a formal test would be a final examination administered by a teacher in a classroom, or an IQ test administered by a psychologist in a clinic. Formal testing often results in a grade or a test score. A test score may be interpreted with regards to a norm or criterion, or occasionally both. The norm may be established independently, or by statistical analysis of a large number of participants. A standardized test is any test that is administered and scored in a consistent manner to ensure legal defensibility. Standardized tests are often used in education, professional certification, psychology, the military, and many other fields. A non-standardized test is usually flexible in scope and format, variable in difficulty and significance. Since these tests are usually developed by individual instructors, the format and difficulty of these tests may not be widely adopted or used by other instructors or institutions. A non-standardized test may be used to determine the proficiency level of students, to motivate students to study, and to provide feedback to students. In some instances, a teacher may develop non-standardized tests that resemble standardized tests in scope, format, and difficulty for the purpose of preparing the students for an upcoming standardized test. Finally, the frequency and setting by which a non-standardized tests are administered are highly variable and are usually constrained by the duration of the class period. A class instructor may, for example, administer a test on a weekly basis or just twice a semester, depending on the policy of the instructor or institution. The duration of each test itself may last for only 5 minutes to an entire class period. In contrast to non-standardized tests, standardized tests are widely used, fixed in terms of scope, difficulty and format, and are usually significant in consequences. Standardized tests are usually held on fixed dates as determined by the test developer, educational institution, or governing body, which may or may not be administered by the instructor, held within the classroom, or constrained by the classroom period. Although there is little variability between different copies of the same type of standardized test, there is variability between different types of standardized tests. Any test with important consequences for the individual test taker is referred to as a high-stakes test. A test may be developed and administered by an instructor, a clinician, a governing body, or a test provider. In some instances, the developer of the test may not be directly responsible for its administration. For example, Educational Testing Service, a non-profit educational testing and assessment organization, develops standardized tests such as the SAT but may not directly be involved in the administration or proctoring of these tests. As with the development and administration of educational tests, the format and level of difficulty of the tests themselves are highly variable, and there is no general consensus or invariable standard for test formats and difficulty. difficulty. Often, the format and difficulty of the test is dependent upon the educational philosophy of the instructor, subject matter, class size, policy of the educational institution, and requirements of accreditation or governing bodies. In general, tests developed and administered by individual instructors are non-standardized, whereas tests developed by testing organizations are standardized. History. Early history. Ancient China was the first country in the world that implemented a nationwide standardized test, which was called the imperial examination. The main purpose of this examination was to select able candidates for specific governmental positions. The imperial examination was established by the Sui dynasty in 605 AD and was later abolished by the Qing dynasty 1,300 years later in 1905. England had adopted this examination system in 1806 to select specific candidates for positions in Her Majesty's civil service. Modeled on the Chinese imperial examination, this examination system was later applied to education, and it started to influence other parts of the world as it became a prominent standard of delivering standardized tests. Modern era. Civil service as the profession transitioned to the modern mass education system. The style of examination became fixed, with the stress on standardized papers to be sat by large numbers of students. Leading the way in this regard was the burgeoning civil service that began to move toward a meritocratic basis for selection in the mid-19th century. In England, British civil service was influenced by the imperial examinations system and meritocratic system of China. Thomas Taylor Meadows, Britain's consul in Guangzhou, China, argued in his desultory notes on the government and people of China, published in 1847, that the long duration of the Chinese Empire is solely and altogether owing to the good government which consists in the advancement of men of talent and merit only, and that the British must reform the civil service by making the institution meritocratic. As early as in 1806, the Honourable East India Company established a college near London to train and examine administrators of the company's territories in India. Examinations for the Indian civil service, a term coined by the company, were introduced in 1829. In 1853, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, William Gladstone, commissioned Sir Stafford Northcote and Charles Trevelyan to look into the operation and organization of the civil service. Influenced by the ancient Chinese imperial examination, the Northcote-Trevelyan Report of 1854 made four principal recommendations: that recruitment should be on the basis of merit determined through standardized written examination, that candidates should have a solid general education to enable interdepartmental transfers, that recruits should be graded into a hierarchy, and that promotion should be through achievement rather than preferment, patronage or purchase. A civil service commission was also set up in 1855 to oversee open recruitment and patronage, and most of the other Northcote-Trevelyan recommendations were implemented over some years. The Northcote-Trevelyan model of meritocratic examination remained essentially stable for 100 years. This was a tribute to its success in removing corruption, delivering public services, and responding effectively to political change. It also had a great international influence and was adapted by members of the Commonwealth. The Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act established a similar system in the United States. Education written examinations have been unheard of before 1702 for European education. The Chinese examinations were described repeatedly in Western literature on China of the 17th and 18th centuries. Standardized testing began to influence the method of examination in British universities from the 1850s, where oral examination had been the norm since the Middle Ages. In the US, the transition happened under the influence of the educational reform former Horace Mann. This shift decisively helped to move education into the modern era by standardizing expanding curricula in the sciences and humanities, creating a rationalized method for the evaluation of teachers and institutions, and creating a basis for the streaming of students according to ability. Both World War I and World War II demonstrated the necessity of standardized testing and the benefits associated with these tests. Tests were used to determine the mental aptitude of recruits of the military. The U.S. Army used the Stanford Binet Intelligence Scale to test the IQ of the soldiers. After the war, industry began using tests to evaluate applicants for various jobs based on performance. In 1952, the first advanced placement test was administered to begin closing the gap between high schools and colleges. Modern-day use of tests. Education. Some countries such as the United Kingdom and France require all the secondary school students to take a standardized test on individual subjects, such as the General Certificate of Secondary Education and Baccalaureate respectively, as a requirement for graduation. These tests are used primarily to assess a student's proficiency in specific subjects such as mathematics, science, or literature. In contrast, high school students in other countries such as the United States may not be required to take a standardized test to graduate. Moreover, students in these countries usually take standardized tests only to apply for a position in university program and are typically given the option of taking different standardized tests such as the ACT-SAT, which are used primarily to measure a student's reasoning skill. High school students in the United States may also take advanced placement tests on specific subjects to fulfill university-level credit. Depending on the policies of the test maker or country, administration of standardized tests may be done in a large hall, classroom, or testing center. A proctor or invigilator may also be present during the testing period to provide instructions, to answer questions, or to prevent cheating. Grades or test scores from standardized tests may also be used by universities to determine if a student applicant should be admitted into one of its academic or professional programs. For example, universities in the United Kingdom admit applicants into their undergraduate programs based primarily or solely on an applicant's grades on pre-university qualifications such as the GCE A-levels or Cambridge Pre-U. In contrast, universities in the United States use an applicant's test score on the SAT or ACT as just one of the many admission criteria to determine if an applicant should be admitted into one of its undergraduate programs. The other criteria in this case may include the applicant's grades from high school, extracurricular activities, personal statement, and letters of recommendations. Once admitted, undergraduate students in the United Kingdom or United States may be required by the respective programs to take a comprehensive examination as a requirement for passing the courses or for graduating from the respective programs. Standardized tests are sometimes used by certain countries to manage the quality of their educational institutions. For example, the No Child Left Behind Act in the United States requires individual states to develop assessments for students in certain grades. In practice, these assessments typically appear in the form of standardized tests. Test scores of students in specific grades of an educational institution are then used to determine the status of that educational institution, i.e., whether it should be allowed to continue to operate in the same way or to receive funding. Finally, standardized tests are sometimes used to compare proficiencies of students from different institutions or countries. For example, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development uses Program for International Student Assessment to evaluate certain skills and knowledge of students from different participating countries. licensing and certification. Standardized tests are sometimes used by certain governing bodies to determine if a test taker is allowed to practice a profession, to use a specific job title, or to claim competency in a specific set of skills. For example, a test taker who intends to become a lawyer is usually required by a governing body such as a governmental bar licensing agency to pass a bar exam. Immigration and naturalization. Standardized tests are also used in certain countries to regulate immigration. For example, intended immigrants to Australia are legally required to pass a citizenship test as part of that country's naturalization process. Intelligence quotient competitions. Tests are sometimes used as a tool to select for participants that have potential to succeed in a competition such as a sporting event. For example, serious skaters who wish to participate in figure skating competitions in the United States must pass official U.S. figure skating tests just to qualify. Group memberships. Tests are sometimes used by a group to select for certain types of individuals to join the group. For example, Mensa International is a high IQ society that requires individuals to score at the 98th percentile or higher on a standardized, supervised IQ test. Test preparations. For the perspective of a test developer, there is great variability with respect to time and effort needed to prepare a test. Likewise, from the perspective of a test taker, there is also great variability with respect to the time needed to obtain a desired grade or score on any given test. When a test developer constructs a test, the amount of time and effort is dependent upon the significance of the test itself, the proficiency of the test taker, the format of the test, class size, deadline of test, and experience of the test developer. The process of test construction has been greatly aided in several ways. For one, many test developers were themselves students at one time, and therefore are able to modify or outright adopt test questions from the previous tests. In some countries such as the United States, book publishers often provide teaching packages that include test banks to university instructors who adopt the published books for their courses. These test banks may contain up to 4,000 sample test questions that have been peer-reviewed and time-tested. The instructor who chooses to use this test bank would only have to select a fixed number of test questions from this test bank to construct a test. As with test constructions, the time needed for a test taker to prepare for a test is dependent upon the frequency of the test developer, and the significance of the test. In general, non-standardized tests that are short, frequent, and do not constitute a major portion of the test taker's overall course grade or score required do not require the test taker to spend great amounts preparing for the test. Conversely, non-standardized tests that are long, infrequent, and do constitute a major portion of the test taker's overall course grade or score usually require the test taker to spend great amounts preparing for the test. To prepare for a non-standardized test, test takers may rely upon the reference books, class lecture notes, internet, and past experience to prepare for the test. Test takers may also use various learning aids to study for tests such as flashcards and mnemonics. Test takers may even hire tutors to coach them through the process so that they may increase the probability of obtaining a desired test grade or score. Finally, test takers may rely upon past copies of a test from previous years of semesters to study for a future test. These past tests may be provided by a friend or a group that has copies of previous tests from instructors and their institutions. Unlike non-standardized tests, the time needed by test takers to prepare for standardized tests are less variable and usually considerable. This is because standardized standardized tests are usually uniformed in scope, format, and difficulty, and often have important consequences with respect to a test taker's future, such as a test taker's eligibility to attend a specific university program or to enter a desired profession. It is not unusual for test takers to prepare for standardized tests by relying upon commercially available books that provide in-depth coverage of the standardized test or compilations of previous tests. In many countries, test takers even enroll in test preparation centers or cram schools that provide extensive or supplementary instructions to test takers to help them better prepare for a standardized test. Finally, in some countries, instructors and their institutions have also played a significant role in preparing test takers for a standardized test. Cheating on tests. Cheating on a test is the process of using unauthorized means or methods for the purpose of obtaining a desired test score or grade. This may range from bringing and using notes during a closed book examination, to copying another test taker's answer or choice of answers during an individual test, to sending a paid proxy to take the test. Several common methods have been employed to combat cheating. They include the use of multiple proctors or invigilators during a testing period to monitor test takers. Test developers may construct multiple variants of the same test to be administered to different test takers at the same time. In some cases, instructors themselves may not administer their own tests but will leave the task to other instructors or invigilators, which may mean that the invigilators do not know the candidates, and thus some form of identification may be required. Finally, instructors or test providers may compare the answers of suspected cheaters on the test themselves to determine if cheating did occur. Support and criticisms of tests. Despite the widespread use, the validity, quality, or use of tests, particularly standardized tests in education, have continued to be widely supported or criticized. Like the tests themselves, supports and criticisms of tests are often varied and may come from a variety of sources such as parents, test takers, instructors, business groups, universities, or governmental watchdogs. Supporters of standardized tests in education often provide the following reasons for promoting testing in education: feedback, a diagnosis of test takers' performance. Fair and efficient, promotes accountability, prediction and selection, improves performance. Critics of standardized tests in education often provide the following reasons for revising or removing standardized tests in education: narrows curricular format and encourages teaching to the test. Poor predictive quality, grade inflation of test scores or grades, culturally or socio-economically biased. Other types of tests and other related terms. Ordinary exam, an exam taken during the corresponding course. Sufficiency exam or examination for credit, an exam which should be taken as a way of getting official credits from the academic institution. Revalidation exam or equivalence exam, offering value for an exam previously taken in another institution. Extraordinary exam, an exam taken after the period of ordinary exams corresponding to the course.